Great, thank you so much, Liz and Sue, for the lovely introduction. I am delighted to be here, and it's always such a pleasure to be asked to come and talk about things that you're really genuinely passionate about. And so a couple of things that I am passionate about: diversity, equity, inclusion work and coaching. And I'm going to talk to you today about where those two things meet for me. And although I'm going to be talking about coaching, I'm also really, when I talk about coaching, talking about leadership, talking about an approach to working with people that I think is at the heart of how we do leadership. And I'm going to give you opportunities through this morning's session to reflect, because I think reflective spaces are the spaces that we often most need as educators and as leaders. I'm going to give you opportunities to challenge your thinking, because you are challenge partners, and because there is no better time than in the liminal moment of where we have been and where we are going to really challenge your thinking about what comes next. And on today, the awful commemoration of the death of George Floyd, I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about decolonising our practice, to think about why any of us working in education would even want to decolonise our practice, to think about trauma, and to think about race. So loads to do in the next hour and 20 minutes, I think I have, and I won't be talking at you for all of it. But let's start by just sharing with you what I hope we are going to cover and what I hope you'll get out of this. So thinking through some ways of working with trauma and race. Thinking through the principles of decolonising our work, because of course, many of us have been in the last year in particular in schools in which decolonising our practice has become parlance. Decolonising our curriculum has become the thing that we talk about. Well, what does that actually mean? And what would it mean to decolonise our work? I'm going to ask you to think about how you might build a set of decolonising coaching strategies, or at least decolonising leadership strategies. And I'm going to ask you to apply a critical lens to the way that you work. Before we do any of this, I'm going to start off with a question for you. And the question is, who do you advocate for? And I'm going to kind of offer you a bit of a snippet of my journey. So, as Sue said, I am a Bristol educator. I've been educating young people in the Southwest for most of my time in education, and I've worked typically, although I've worked in a range of different institutions and a range of different types of school, I've typically worked with children and families who were failing to thrive in some way. So families who were failing to thrive because they were on the periphery of what economically getting by might look like. Families who were failing to thrive because they were newly arrived into the UK because they were asylum seekers. Children who were failing to thrive because of the impact of poverty on their lives. Children who were failing to thrive because in our English education system, not having English as a first language made that transition really, really challenging for them. Children who were failing to thrive because they had social, emotional, behavioural difficulties, disabilities. Children who were failing to thrive because they couldn't find a place for themselves in the school system that felt like they were seen, they were understood, they were acknowledged, and that the education system managed to form itself around them. And actually, as I look back over that time, I feel really touched by the opportunity that that's given me. I feel really touched. I feel really honoured to have spent my time with some of those children and those families, to have worked with people from marginalised backgrounds, to have worked almost exclusively with historically marginalised groups, either through poverty or through race. And I know that in my time working in education and now working on the edges of education, that I have committed myself to becoming somewhat of an advocate for those people, for those children, for those families, So for me, there's a relationship between the role of being an educator, the role of being an education leader, and the role of being an advocate in society. Those things have always been really tightly bound for me. And so as we come to this work around decolonizing our practice, I want to ask you, who do you advocate for? Because some of that decolonizing is also tied up with who it is that we think we advocate for. And I share this Angela Davis quote just as a way of stimulating some thinking for you. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. Angela Davis was a huge role model for both of my parents, and I was named after Angela Davis. In fact, she was very prominent in my childhood. But I think this quote is really apt for most of us working in education at the moment, is that there is some sense that we are advocating, that we are trying to change the things that we can no longer accept. And I think that this stirring of advocacy is one of the critical steps that we all take as we make this journey towards decolonizing our work, which is to say, unpacking, breaking down, thinking differently about the ways that we have always done things. Now, the title of this session is Trauma and Decolonizing, and the two things are connected. And so before we go into the decolonizing, I want to kind of draw us out of that and take us back to this idea of working with trauma. And I'm going to explain the relationship between the two pieces, but for now, I just would like you to go with me on this. When we talk about race in the United Kingdom, in the West, usually, when we talk about race and when we talk about diversity, when we talk about the need for equity in institutions, when we talk about inclusion or belonging, when we talk about experiences for people who hold protected identities, protected characteristics, who come from historically marginalized groups, we enter into a space that is hot. It is heated. It is, and I say hot because tempers can flare, certainly when people feel that they are being criticised, when people feel that they are being, that their views are being pushed aside, when people feel that they are being critiqued for their use of language. It's also hot in the physical sense. I don't know if any of you have ever had those conversations about race where you suddenly start thinking, oh no, I'm getting the words wrong. Like we literally bring heat to our faces. We can sometimes prickle with the discomfort of getting gender pronouns wrong. We can find our heart rate increasing as we realise that we're entering a territory when talking about transgender rights, when talking about colleagues or friends or family members who hold identities that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. We can feel a discomfort. And so the work is hot and heated because it typically includes levels of discomfort that most of us would rather bypass. And so rather than bypassing it, what I say is to bring presence to that discomfort, to bring presence to those feelings, and to just acknowledge that it's there. And in order to do that, we need to take care. We need to take care of the way that we feel. We need to take care of the ways that other people might feel. And taking care is a bit more, I would say, than giving a trigger warning. You know that thing that happens when people say, I'm going to share something now, trigger warning, and then they just share something completely inappropriate in the moment. And you think, oh my goodness, I need more than a trigger warning for that. That's, you know, if that involves racial violence, that's a bit too much. I need more than that. You need to prepare me for that. If this involves an anecdote in which somebody's going to be, I'm going to recognize somebody being abused by this situation or oppressed in this situation, I need more than a trigger warning, because the work is hot, it's heated, and it's physical. And often we feel it viscerally. So I want to share something with you before we even get started. And I did a version of this last time I talked to Challenge Partners group, and it's a grounding exercise, and it's a grounding exercise that I use at the beginning of my work as a as a way of physically saying trigger warning, as a way of allowing us to enter into discussions about this work that is healthy. And this exercise comes from Resmaa Menakem's work. So any of you that have ever heard me talk before will have heard me reference him. And so what I want you to do for this grounding exercise, and you can do this with your screen, with your camera off, if you'd rather, nothing particularly dramatic is going to happen, but you might find it more comfortable to sit with your camera off, is I would like you to sit with your both feet on the ground, like pressed into the ground. And I want you to sit with your hands on your lap. Both your hands, one hand on each knee if possible. So your legs are not crossed, both feet on the ground, hands on your lap. And I'd like you to stare straight ahead. So just look straight ahead and just notice where you are in this moment. Notice what's landed about what I've said so far, and notice anything that you might be bringing into the session. And just notice how you're feeling right now and what's still in the air, what's still on your mind and isn't allowing you to ground. And just pay attention to those pieces. And then I would like you to look over your left shoulder, and you're going to use your neck and you're going to use your hips. So you're going to look all the way over your left shoulder, right to the back of the room, engaging your neck and your hips. And just stay there for a moment. And then come all the way back. And again, you're moving your head and your hips. So you're coming back to center and really feeling what it's like to bring your hips and your neck and your head back into center alignment. And with your hands still on your knees. And I am going to now ask you to look up, all the way up, all the way up. And then back to center. And then you're going to look all the way down, 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 down. And back to center. And then I want you to look all the way over your right shoulder this time, and you're going to engage your neck, and then you're going to engage your hips to give you a full turn to the back of the room. And when we do this, we're engaging the psoas nerve, we're engaging the vagal, and that's like our kind of reptilian self. That's the deeply human and animal part of us. And then you're going to come back to center. And then just be quiet for a moment and stare straight ahead and notice what's shifted. And there should be greater presence there, greater sense of being here in your body, in the room. And just take a breath and then let it out. And you can turn your cameras back on if you had your camera off. And that exercise is a really simple exercise. I give any of you that are working in situations that are going to be difficult, but I also offer you, if you do nothing of this decolonizing practice, but you know that you're going to have a difficult meeting with a parent, or you know you're going to have a difficult meeting with a member of staff, is to give yourself a moment to do that and kind of ground yourself into your body. So that's the first part of taking care, of doing more than just offering a trigger warning, of bringing us into a space in which we can enter into the work. And the second part of a bit of pre-paving that I do whenever I do diversity, equity, inclusion work, whenever I coach people, is I bring this quality of luminary listening, of fertile listening, and soon, Liz, you would have seen this before. And this is such important work and often overlooked, because in the urgency to get to the point, like, what's decolonizing? What's trauma? Come on, let's talk about it. Let's do it. That's what it said on the title. Often we miss this important piece of pre-paving that allows the work to land properly. So the second piece I want to share with you is fertile listening. And fertile listening is comprised of 3 strands. And it is a new way of listening. It's a way of listening that engages us in the work. And it also has the capacity to change people's lives when you do this well. So the first strand of fertile listening is unconditional positive regard. And as coaches, this is the kind of fundamental teaching of coaching. This is coach training. Is you bring unconditional positive regard to the person sitting in front of you. And my mantra is, they were born, so they are worthy. The only qualification that's needed. And in this work, when you bring unconditional positive regard, it means that whatever somebody throws at you, however upset, abused, unhappy somebody feels, as we're in this realm of diversity, equity, inclusion, as we're talking about institutional oppression, as we're talking about marginalization, when we bring unconditional positive regard, we put the human first. And so we're not letting people off the hook, but we are giving them the opportunity to be human. The second strand of fertile listening that I want to share with you is pre-appreciation. And so in a setting like this, pre-appreciation, which is when you offer appreciation to a person before they've spoken, might look like you saying to me, Angie, I'm so grateful that you're here to talk to us today. I'm so grateful that you're here to share a piece of your journey with us. I really value it. I'm really interested to hear where this goes. I feel really excited about the possibilities of this session. And you can imagine what pre-appreciation would do for me if you were to say that to me. It would be like, oh, I suddenly feel flooded with the opportunities. I suddenly feel really excited about what it is I have to say. I'm suddenly gifted the confidence that what I have to say is going to be useful. And when you're working in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, where I've seen this done really well, is when you are asking, when people have offered or volunteered to bring their lived experience to you or to a group. When somebody says, well, actually, I've been that, I've been that gay person in your organization, and I can tell you it's not great. Can I tell you about what it's been like to work in this school and to be a gay person? And you might offer them pre-appreciation by saying, I just for a moment before you even speak, I just want to honor your bravery. I just want you to know that you sharing your lived experience is going to make a difference, not just to me, but also to the lives of other people, because I know that when I hear this, I'm going to have the opportunity to change something. So thank you so much for being prepared to do this. Yeah, can you see how pre-appreciation suddenly opens the doorway for that kind of sharing? And then there's the final strand, and almost the most, I don't know, they're all important, but it's like the favourite child. My favourite child of these three then is being fertile ground. And being fertile ground is a different kind of listening. It's listening in a way that what is said lands as though it's landing on fertile ground. So we listen in order that new realizations and understandings emerge. We become the place that new things can be born. The moment of the conversation is a new moment in which new realizations are born for you as the person listening, but also for the speaker. So this is a generous act. Fertile listening is generosity. And with those three things, plus a grounding exercise, we're now ready to start thinking about the content. So let's do that. So first of all, I want to talk about the place of trauma in leadership, in our, the place of being trauma aware in leadership and in coaching. And I want to talk about it, and I think it's important because as a coach, I mainly work with women. I mainly coach women, and I coach women who have been the wrong side of often HR processes, who return to work after maternity and found things had changed, or who have sought multiple promotions and it hasn't ever quite worked out, and they're trying to work out why. Sometimes the traumatizing effects of being a mum and leaving your kids and then coming to work and then not feeling good enough, some of that creates a level of trauma. I also coach a large group of women who would identify as being Black, Asian, minority ethnic. And so for them, trauma has been the intersection often of race and being a woman and being in the workplace. And that trauma manifests itself in different ways, sometimes in anxiety, sometimes in anger, sometimes in fear. And I coach in organizations, I coach in institutions where there has been trauma felt by children, felt by families, often, working in areas where there are high levels of trauma as a result of the community being derived mainly of asylum-seeking families. So trauma is kind of all around us. And as leaders, it's really important, and as coaches, it's really important that we are trauma aware and that we understand that where we are seeing that it's important that we understand that sometimes we're seeing the effects of trauma versus a human being who is perfectly, whole and safe and fine. And so there are several ways of understanding trauma, but I just want to share these 3 E's with you. So the first is that there is often an event or a series of events that lead to trauma. And I've used in this slide the example of watching the 10-minute and 6-second video of George Floyd being murdered. That's a horrific act that led to a man's death, a horrific, traumatizing experience for any of us that watched that video to see a life taken. It's traumatizing. Another layer of trauma exists there, as depending on the identities that we hold. Some of us I don't know about you, but I felt the trauma of the girl who'd filmed that video. She was a school-age girl, who I felt her trauma in her being the person who'd filmed that. So an event, being aware of an event that has caused trauma brings awareness to the situation. And then this next piece is experience of the event. So different people will assign different layers of meaning to individual events. Some of us have seen videos of Black people being killed or assaulted by the police over the last year. And since the murder of George Floyd, have felt re-traumatized because we have such high hopes, not just Black and brown people, all of us, right, has such high hopes that things would change, and yet we keep seeing the same thing happening over and over again. And many of us feel really powerless to do anything about it because we're not in the police force and we're not in America or even in this country. We don't know what to do. Sometimes we see social media images and they're quite traumatizing. And depending on the identity that we hold, we might feel as though so for me as a Black woman, I often feel as though the experience of seeing other Black bodies being brutalized is heartbreaking. In my head, I feel like I probably feel like in my head, actually, I think it's heartbreaking. I feel a secondary thing, which is fear, often for myself, and because I have a brown son, I feel fear for him. And then very viscerally, on a physical level, I can feel my heart rate raising. And I don't know if that's just the experience I have, but I'm aware of other people who are also in brown bodies who also feel that. So trauma exists on multiple levels, depending on the event and depending on our experience of the event, depending on how closely we feel we assign meaning or identity to the event. And so the first bit of reflection, I'm aware that I've talked quite a bit. The first reflection I want you to have, and this is just a personal reflection in your notebooks, is on where you can see trauma located, either in your institution or in a dynamic that you are involved in. And I'm not going to ask you to share these. So this is a personal reflection on where you see trauma either in your institution or within a personal dynamic that you are currently involved in. I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to make some sketchy notes about that. And I would like you to add another layer to what it is that you're writing about. And I would like you to just make a note again. I'm not going to ask you to share these, but I'd like you to make a note on the effects that you feel trauma has. So if you're talking about an institutional, if you've identified an institutional example of trauma, I'd like you to just, having identified it, write about what you think the effects of that trauma are currently on the organisation, on the institution, or on people involved. And if you are talking about an interpersonal experience of trauma that's manifested, I'd like you to write about the effects of that, either on you or on the other person. And then what I would like you to do is, using whatever it is you've just written about as the basis, the foundation stone for exploration, is I want you to deepen the thinking around trauma, but I want you to apply what your thinking is currently around trauma specifically to a challenge, a diversity, equity, inclusion challenge or issue. So if you might have been thinking about trauma as it applies to a relationship you have with a family member, for example. What I want you to do now is I want you to think about trauma as it relates to a diversity, equity, or inclusion challenge or issue, and ideally one that is happening or taking place in your institution. So an example of this would be that came out of last week for me was well, it wasn't directly for me, for people I was working with last week, were the events that have been unfolding in Palestine. And so the trauma, the effect of the trauma was felt by Palestinian students in a school that where I was working with leaders. And their experience of that event was very up close and personal because some of them had, have family in Palestine. And the kind of ongoing impact and effects were also being felt by Jewish students in the school, by staff who don't know how to hold that situation, don't know how to manage that. So the impact of that was being felt by many. They tried to do an assembly, and the trauma was such that the emotions were very difficult to handle for the children, for the staff. People were being constantly re-traumatized because every time you turn on the news or you look at social media, there are horrific images of young people who have just lost their houses, of children who don't have parents. So that, you know, that's a really, really kind of tangible event that has taken place recently, that's manifesting itself in schools. So I'd like you to apply what we've just been thinking about to a diversity, equity, or inclusion issue or challenge, if you can. Okay. And then I would like to, and I'm going to ask you to speak into the space in a moment, but I would like you at this point just to put some, that note, let's ask somebody to speak now. Would somebody be prepared to just raise a hand and share share something that you've just been writing about? Carolyn? I'm great at waiting.
Sorry, I couldn't see how to put my hand up. So
okay. Maybe no one can see. Do you not have reaction? Just wave at me then if I ask that again.
No, I guess I was thinking about, so I work in special academies, and I think sometimes we're dealing a lot with children who have suffered all kinds of abuse or have been used because of their vulnerability, have suffered bullying or exclusion. So I guess we're quite used to seeing trauma and also attachment issues with our young people. So many of them have been rejected and have been in and out of foster care and things. So it's something that we're fairly used to seeing. And it's, I think when you begin to think of the cases, it's quite scary on how often our staff are dealing with some really challenging circumstances. So, you know, from a young man who came into my office, he started with us in sixth form and had been in mainstream all his life. And he came into my office in an absolute rage on his first day. And I thought, oh, goodness, you know, he's not fitting in here, or, you know, and he just said, all my life, there's been people like me and no one's ever let me see them. And this is the first time I feel like I'm not a freak, because I've been treated like a freak all my life. And so sometimes it's things that you can't undo, you can't change the past. And I guess for staff, it's about, you know, understanding that you can't be responsible for finding solutions to everything, but you can try and understand and listen and be there for young people. And I guess sometimes it is things like that that's crazy, because everyone thinks inclusion is a great thing. And yet there was an example where somebody didn't need to be included where someone thought they belonged, because belonging came from a neurotypical idea of what inclusion looks like. So so I guess it makes you rethink those different parameters of how people see things.
Thank you so much, and that's such a great segue. So hold that thought, because that is exactly what we're going to be exploring, and the relationship between trauma and what neurotypical is, the relationship between trauma and what normal schooling is, or between trauma and what our institutions say, you know, think, and the way things should be, are really, really closely linked. And that's kind of what I want you to start unpacking as we go on through the session. So thank you for that. Margaret, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I will tell you a personal experience in relation to trauma that I didn't know I had until recently. Growing up in Ireland and traveling across to Northern Ireland, I remember as a very young child being awoke from my aunt's car by a gun moving the blanket away from on top of me. And it was only going down central London a very short time ago with a nursing friend. I reacted very badly when I seen some police officers with guns. Well, not very badly, but I just looked at them and she said to me, it looks like you've got post-traumatic stress. You know, it had never been identified in all this time. But yeah, I would say that trauma is a lifelong condition unless it's dealt with. So we need to support our young people and in trying to come to terms with a trauma in their lives.
Yeah, 100%, and it's such a relevant example, Margaret. And thank you so much for sharing, for sharing that. And what I want to invite you all to do is to of course say yes, this is relevant in the lives of our children, but it's also relevant in the lives of all adults. And when you are working in institutions as leaders or coaches, being aware, being trauma aware, as we're looking at the ways that other adults we work with respond to things, is a really vital part of being able to engage in the exchange of coaching, in being able to engage in the exchange of this work. And particularly when you then add the layer of diversity, equity, inclusion on top of it. So Carolyn, you really helpfully talked about neurodiversity. And when we start to think about people who come from historically marginalized groups, unless we also think about trauma in their experience, we are discounting a huge amount of what has come before the moment that young man came into your office. A huge amount had already happened. And that is typically the case for people who come from historically marginalized backgrounds. So I just want you to kind of hold that thought. And both Margaret and Carolyn, those are both incredibly relevant and helpful shares. So thank you for that. So let me just, can you see my screen or can you see my notes? Okay. Okay, so I want to just think about responsiveness then here to trauma. There are obviously going to be ways of working with this differently. One of the things is to recognise, most of you are educators, so you're practiced in recognising. One of the things is also to bring a great deal of presence, personal presence, when you're in the face of trauma. And sometimes often trauma arises when I'm in a coaching relationship with people, because they are people from historically marginalized backgrounds. And so bringing my responsiveness is often a very kind of physical presence, is a breath presence, is an unconditional positive regard presence, and resisting re-traumatization. And that's really, really key. So we don't ask people to kind of to dredge. We allow people the space to speak. We allow people the opportunity to share. But we, as much as we feel like it might be important to get to the bottom of what's been going on in order to sort things out, that's not often the moment. And certainly unless we're trained in psychotherapy or we are therapists, it's not the place either. So as coaches, as leaders, our job is to realize the widespread impact of it, to recognize it, to be able to be with it, and to resist re-traumatizing people. Okay, so I did promise you that there is a relationship between this and then decolonizing our practice. And for me, this intersect around being trauma aware and decolonization comes as we start, and you can see it in that relationship, as we start to decenter ourselves in relation to others, and to position ourselves on an equal footing at the very least, to recognize ourselves not necessarily as coach and coachee, but as two people who are human beings in the moment together, one of whom is opening up a space to allow the other to become more human, to express the fullness of their humanity. and that's it. And so the relationship between decolonizing leadership, decolonizing coaching, and minimizing the effects of trauma are like that. So what is colonization then? In itself, decolonization is the undoing of colonial rule that we have understood to be a framework for our lives. All of us, whatever our colour, whatever our race in the West, have an understanding of the West as holding colonial rule over subordinate nations, subordinate countries. And so to decolonize ourselves, to take part in decolonization, means us committing to freeing our minds from colonial ideology. And those, the key ideology, I guess, there is that there is something to be colonized that is inferior. Essentially it's describing a power dynamic. The colonized is inferior. And if we can just hold that as the key concept that requires unpacking, much of the rest of the work happens on its own. Decolonization then offers us a way of critiquing positions of power, of critiquing dominance and dominant cultures. And so a decolonized mindset is one that we can bring to anything that we do. It's one that we can bring to our schools, to our playgrounds, to our classrooms, to our relationships, to the way that our families have Christmas dinner. I mean, it can be brought to anything because it's simply about power. And when we start to think about the possibilities of inhabiting a decolonized mind, it provides us with an opportunity to relearn what has been pushed aside in favor of the colonizer, and what's been pushed aside or buried within all of us as an oppressive version of reality seeks to take control. And so I'm kind of packaging it like this because I want to take you out of the idea that colonization is about white over non-white. Colonization is just power. Colonization has happened to all of us, and we all experience the trauma of what colonization means. In different ways, as our relationship to it will be different, but we all experience it. And so committing to decolonization is almost committing to what's been forgotten, what's been buried. And committing to decolonization is committing to being disruptive, is committing to thinking and asking questions about, well, whose neurotypical version of reality is this? And what does neurotypical even mean? Whose whose fat shaming version of clothes shopping is this? What is a normal size for women anyway? And is there one? Whose version of reality is it where those people are all white men and they're CEOs? Why is that a good thing? Who decided that? So do you see what I mean? Decolonization is about disrupting the way that we think. And that's really all it means. So when we think about decolonizing our curriculum, we're just thinking about disrupting our ideas about knowledge production. We're thinking about disrupting our ideas about identity in our curriculum. We're disrupting ideas about how knowledge is communicated as well as produced. And it is a much more complicated process then than just saying, let's put some diverse figures in the curriculum. Yeah, it's about so much more than that. And in fact, it's about something that's so much more exciting. That's something we can all get behind with quite a lot of excitement and anticipation and pleasure, I would hope. And so if we apply decolonizing and decolonizing our mind and decolonizing the way that we think to coaching and to leadership, what's created is something really, really revolutionary. Because in practice, when we decolonize coaching, and by coaching, feel free to read leadership. we connect to humans again. We connect to the humanization of the work. When we decolonize coaching, we begin to recognize that somebody has created a construct in which there is a coach who holds information and power, if only about the coaching process, who holds the space, who invites somebody else in, and with knowledge and wisdom, supports somebody else in getting a better understanding of themselves. If we commit to decolonizing coaching, we start to commit to the idea that the coach doesn't necessarily hold any power, particularly within a hierarchy. So that relationship is up for grabs. We can begin to look at what it might mean to exist in that relationship without hierarchy or power. But the content of the coaching also changes. Because typically, if we think about coaching as leaders, we think about coaching, if you're a head teacher and you're coaching a middle leader who eventually wants to make it into headship, we are typically coaching within the institution of a hierarchy. We're coaching somebody to move from one position in the hierarchy toward another position in the hierarchy. And often coaching makes the opportunity of that person being able to move from point A to point B something that's entirely in the coachee's hands. So we make assumptions that the institution is neutral and that the coachee is the person that has to navigate the neutral institution. When we commit to decolonizing our thinking, we can commit to questioning the neutrality of the institution. Is that institution neutral? Is it neutral for the women? Is my coaching encouraging women to navigate a system that I'm telling them is neutral, when in actual fact, evidence suggests it's not entirely neutral? Evidence suggests there is a hierarchy at play. Evidence suggests that that institution itself is a colonized seat, is an area in which there is the playing out of all sorts of hierarchy, of power and of oppression. And so as we commit to this work, we commit to kind of undoing, breaking down, exploring our understanding of where oppression lurks, of where power exists. And we commit to beginning to equalize the roles of coach and coachee. And what we also, of course, do is begin to center what the coachee brings, the coachee's cultural, political identity. And that's where we then begin to tie in this work around understanding trauma, about being aware, trauma aware, because of course we begin to center the coachee's experiences. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking again, and I'm going to put you into a few breakout rooms. In fact, Liz, could you help me put?
Yes. Do you want them in threes?
Threes would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do in these breakout rooms, and I'm just going to give you 5 minutes. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think of a coaching relationship that you are in. And I'd like you just to describe or write down as many of the dynamics that you can think of that are in play. And so by that, I mean, it could be that you're coaching somebody that's subordinate to you in the hierarchy. It could be that you're coaching somebody sideways, and there'll be various dynamics there. It could be that you're coaching somebody that's white, somebody that's black. You could be coaching a woman. You could be a man. There will be all sorts of dynamics at play in that coaching relationship. And I want you to write down or describe or discuss as many of them as you can think of I'll give you 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, that's 2 minutes each. Interesting. Gary, can I ask you?
Yeah. Okay. So Jodine talked about being coached and not necessarily being the coach, but within the coachee. That was particularly with Getting Ahead in London. Mm-hmm. Amanda talked about it in terms of organisationally, a teach and learning development, sort of 3-week cycle, not linked to appraisal, but linked to improvement, but that careful nuance between improvement and just having a genuine dialogue. which is always interesting. But then she also talks about she does have a kind of more formal, if you like, with a vice principal.
Yeah.
But that has caused, well, it can cause issues of hierarchical, who are you in this position? Are you really allowed to, well, what if the VP wanted to talk about the head, you know?
Yes.
Or talk about exploring issues that they're really, so it could be quite surface level type stuff.
Yeah.
And then I just talked about things that I'm involved in, sort of more like group coaching dynamics, collaborative appraisal, working with middle leaders, coaching in dialogue with school improvement. So, but trying to be genuine in an organisation where you kind of go, it's all about standards and performance. And trying to get rid of that a little bit in order for standards performance to come through. Not let it be the focus. So that's what we covered.
Brilliant, thank you. There's so much richness there, and that's kind of the piece around who's coaching who and where's the power and who, and is it safe to say this with this person, and can I be in this, and what role am I in? All of those things are things that we possibly don't pay enough attention to before we launch into the coaching container. So some of this work around decolonizing this space is being very upfront about that. This is a coaching container that I intend to decolonize. I'm going to think about this differently. So what role are we both here to play? Because I would like to coach and I'd like to be side by side with you. But that means that some of the things that happen in this coaching space, we need to have an acknowledgement are not about performance or will not come back at me in that way. I need to be able to talk about this dimension of the organization without fear of threat or anything else. And so I guess I'm asking you to think about dynamics because I want you to be very careful about the kinds of coaching that you go into, assuming one thing that isn't going to be there at all. Does that make sense? You know, assuming when we talk about coaching, we can sometimes say, oh, it's all coaching, like all coaching's the same, and it isn't, is what I'm trying to say. It is very different. So be aware of the dynamics is one thing. And the second thing is thinking about who you coach. So being aware of dynamics and then being aware of identities and then being aware of multiple identities. And for this, I just want you to write something down very quickly. Just think about somebody that you coach and describe an identity that they hold and just write that down. So you might coach Angie Brown and she is a woman. And then, you might have to make some judgment calls here because you don't necessarily know how the person chooses to identify, but take your best guess at it. And then just add to that. So what's another identity that they hold? So you might have written Angie Brown, she's a woman, and she also identifies as a Black woman. So she has an intersection there, Black and woman. And then, okay, so Angie Brown, Black woman, how does her identity intersect with our context then? So you might write down Angie Brown, Black woman in a multicultural Bristol school where she's the only member of SLT that's a person of colour. And you might just write some ideas about how you think my identity intersects with the context. And then the next piece is then, so what are the implications for my coaching when I'm working with Angie Brown? And for that, we go all the way back into the previous slides and we drag forward. Well, what trauma might she have experienced that she's told me about? How many job interviews did she go for again before she got that job as assistant head here? How many times was she passed over by that and that? Or what was that thing that happened last year? Where do you see what I'm doing? So I'm bringing all of that awareness that I now have about Angie Brown, who is a woman, who is also a Black person, who is also meeting the school context, and I'm thinking then about what that will mean for the coaching that I'm going to do with her. Because Angie Brown doesn't exist as a neutral island within a neutral institution. And if I'm going to decolonize my work and I'm going to commit to that work, then I need to have an awareness of the lack of neutrality actually that's present, and then just be with that. And that's okay too. Okay. I'm aware of time and I want to get through all of these slides so that we've got a bit of time for a couple of questions, hopefully. But this kind of follows on. if we're thinking about decolonizing our coaching, decolonizing our leadership, there is also a need then, and if we stick with Angie Brown, who's the Black woman working as the only Black woman on the SLT in the school, there is also an opportunity to start thinking about working in partnership, and to start thinking about maybe decentering the way that I am now having to be a split personality, but I'm going to imagine myself with my white coach at the time, who was actually a white man, who was a brilliant coach. But I might invite him to start decentering Western thought. I might start asking him to think maybe about how he could decenter his outlook on the world. And that's a really difficult thing for any of us to do. But if my white male coach is working with me as a Black woman in the institution, and he's been to a Red Brick University, and he's had a particular upbringing, and he's kind of found himself in a leadership role and then found himself as a coach, in order to bring decoloniality to the picture, he might need to start looking through a different set of lenses, and he might want to bring some different considerations into the coaching space. So as we begin to work in partnership with people, and as we begin to incorporate their identities, and as we begin to think about what they bring with us into the coaching space, we don't just ask them to bring that and they bring it and sit it next to all of the things that we bring as the colonizer with a particular mindset. We start to take ourselves out of the picture. So we begin to decenter ourselves, our values, our beliefs, our worldview, and we begin to let their worldview take up a bit more space. And so other considerations come into play, which might mean that my coach spends a bit more time preparing for working with me as a Black woman. He begins to think a bit more about what my experiences might have meant for me. He begins to think about the kinds of educational experiences I might have had. He begins to think about whether or not I grew up as economically advantaged as he did or didn't, where I went to university, what my experience of teacher training was like. And he begins to decenter his worldview. So that awareness of different politics and different ways of doing things and different status starts to take up a bit more space. And the next thing, and this is really crucial, and this comes back to unconditional positive regard, is that as somebody who has been coached, who has done coach training or leadership training within a Western Eurocentric institution, which I have. My coach training is entirely kind of, mainstream. And my leadership training was, MPQs and all of those things, and I love them, and I think they were great, but they have a particular worldview. We need to be aware that worldview asserts the notion that people need developing. So MPQs, all of our training, all of our leadership training, coach training, all suggest that somebody kind of needs a bit more. They come to us and they would be okay if they just had a bit more training, or if they just could take on a bit more skill. You've got an MPQML, but if you could get to an MPQSL, well, then we'd be cooking. And if we could get you to MPQH, well, now we're really going somewhere. Because what the model does, what the institution does, is basically suggest that there is a deficit. And coaching and coach training is all about repairing a deficit. It's all about moving someone from somewhere that they're not yet to somewhere where they think they need to be because the institution says they need to be there, and somewhere where in the back of the heads of all coaches, we think they need to be. And I defy anyone to tell me that they've got into a coaching situation and they've not thought, oh, I can get you from there to there. I'm a great coach. I'll get you there. But what this does is it implies that there is something missing. And so a decolonial approach to coaching, decolonized mindset when it comes to coaching, actually asserts the opposite. In its unconditional positive regard, it asserts that coachees come to us whole. They are whole and they are resourceful, and they do not need to be repaired. And so if you want to commit to this work, The question is, how can you reframe the deficit model of coaching and of leadership development? How can you look at the people coming into your office and not think, oh, right, I just need to get them from there to there and then they'll be okay at the head of year? How can you come to that relationship thinking this person is already whole? And what does it mean for the kind of coaching that you engage in? So I'm not expecting you to answer that right now, but I'm offering you these provocations as something to go away with and to think more on. And then the final piece I want to share with you is about space. So one of the things that coaching does, and one of the things that we assert as school leaders often, is that the organisations we work in are ours. I'm the leader, I'm the head teacher of this school, this is my school. If you come into it, you need to play by my rules, if you like. And of course we assert those things to a certain extent, because otherwise there would be chaos. And, you know, we can't have complete mayhem of everyone coming and doing exactly what they like. But being aware of the dynamic that is at play when we assert the space is ours and other people come into it is just an awareness we can bring to our coaching when we're committing to decolonizing our work around coaching and leadership. And all this means is going into a coaching space, and by that I mean it, like literally the room or the space that we create between ourselves and the coachee in that moment, and creating something different, creating the consciousness, the idea, the feeling that the space belongs to us, it is ours. And so in the moment of a coaching relationship, transforming what it can be like for somebody to come to your office and be coached by you into a generous, democratic moment where we are together in a space that we are co-creating. Everyone has access. Everyone has access to this moment, and everyone comes into this moment, this coaching relationship, with equality. Does that make sense? Just nod with me if you're with me. Because sometimes what we do, and we do this very unconsciously, and I think that often we do this when we feel a level of discomfort, or we felt a level of discomfort in institutions, is that we make the progression from being that person who kind of came to a school and sat in reception and thought, oh my goodness, am I going to get the job at the end of this day? I don't know. We make the progression from that person into the person that gets the job and then starts to feel like, yeah, this is my place. And then 5 years later is like, this is my place. And then we become the head or the SLT and we're like, this is my place and this is the way it works. And as we make that progression, we can get into situations where we are unconsciously suggesting that the space doesn't belong to some people, that it belongs more to some of us than to others. And when you try and coach from that place, you are subconsciously saying, I have power here and you don't. And that's not a clean place to coach from. So the space is ours, is just another lens to apply if you're committing to doing this work, or to bringing an aspect of decolonizing your practice to life. I'm aware that I've shared a lot with you this morning, and I could talk about this for probably 1,000 years. Maybe I'll just do this for the rest of my life now. I do, however, want to offer you some opportunity to synthesize and to offer up any reflections that you've had. So just before I close out, if you could maybe make a note of any of the reflections that you have had, or anything that stands out to you from the session that we've had so far. And you will get these slides, so you can, you don't need to rush to thinking of the key reflections, but anything that comes to mind just for now, and then I will stop sharing, and we can just take some feedback from the room. Margaret.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what you just said about us having made assumptions when somebody comes in for coaching. That really made me think, because that person is whole, and why do I feel that, you know, I can make them better? So that was thank you.
Great, thank you. And actually, I think if you take anything away, then that's key. So thanks so much, Margaret. I'm really pleased that was useful. Anyone else like to share something that they would like, that they're going to take away? Johnny.
I'm going to take away, well, I'm going to take away a whole lot. That was great, Angie. Thank you so much. The wider definition of decolonisation, I think, really came through for me, particularly that idea of it being a destructive force of ideas about identity, knowledge, communication, production, and in particular, questions about institutions we operate in, and the idea of neutrality of institutions, and actually unpicking that a little bit. So that's what's coming out for me.
Great, thank you for that. And I think even if you just go back and you commit to using the term decolonisation as it's meant versus the sort of version that we're ending up with, which is a bit mixed in with diversification and a load of other things, then that's really helpful, and really helpful for everybody around as well. Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to share something before I hand back to Sue and Liz? Grace, you look like you're about to speak.
Well, I was thinking, I wasn't going to share, but I was thinking about one of your last points about like the progression from waiting for the word on your interview to kind of owning the place. And I'm very much at the beginning of my career and looking forward to that time when I get to own the place. I'm really thinking kind of intentionally about like the gatekeeping of what that means, and like when I do become the gatekeeper, making that not such a gatekeeping kind of thing, which is easier to say now when I'm here and I'm just looking forward to something that I have been thinking about and want to definitely continue to reflect on.
Fabulous. I'm so up for that. I love that feedback, and I'm always really glad to hear of people challenging the gatekeeper, because it's in all of us, isn't it? It's like, oh, finally I'm there. That's great. Gary, do you have
loads to think about. I just love the way that you've come at this with a very different angle, that it's to do this type of work. Decolonisation requires huge cultural change, and I think that what you're addressing is the kind of like the quality of the conversations in organisation, allowing people to be themselves, that type of thing, but really to look at all the other systems that's needed to line this up in a way in order for you to move forward. Impossible if you don't, so at the beginning I didn't know what the relationship was that you're going to explore, and in the end I do. And can see the applications on our organisation. So thank you, it was brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased that you saw that as well, because I think it's, again, and not to get too meta, but the institution of it kind of wants us to think that we can make it a tiny thing. So there is a vested interest in us just thinking about decolonisation as like a tinkering that we do with our curriculum, versus us being aware of it as a system of operations and interrelations, and so it's not like, and like with any of this work, diversity, equity, inclusion work in general, it's completely overwhelming to imagine unpacking. Okay, let's go ahead and unpack hundreds of years of colonial rule. That's not what I'm saying, but just the awareness is sometimes enough to make us question and do things slightly differently. Right, I will stop talking now, Liz, and Sue, and hand back over to you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. It's been great.
Thank you, Angie. Incredibly powerful, and lots of very positive comments in the chat there about how helpful people have found this. And you really are a tour de force in this field. And I know you've been working with Rob Carpenter's group of schools. And I think the important thing is to get this right throughout institutions. It's a leadership issue, but it really needs to permeate through those organisations to have real impact. And this is the hard stuff. And I think that, hopefully it's a seminal moment that people will recognise that the attention to these issues is really, really vital. We can see things happening across our schools. I think it's positive that young people are finding their voice, but they are questioning, they are challenging, and they're interested and want to engage in this whole debate. And I think if people are not skilled enough or have thought deeply enough about this, that's when things are going horribly wrong in some of our schools. And you can see that in various parts of the country at the moment, when people don't have the confidence to really deal with this in the way in which it should be dealt with. So for me, it's a really, really important piece of work. It's been an absolute privilege to listen to you again, Angie.